Hi everybody, my name is Jessica and I'm a public education specialist with the Fort Worth Public Library. Today we're going over hand sewing basics. Sewing by hand is a skill that's been obscured by fast fashion options. Most people will replace a garment before mending one, thinking that sewing's too hard. I'm here to tell you that sewing by hand is not scary at all. We'll go over the basics from how to thread your needle to patching up some garments. First, let's go over some of the materials we'll be using. Whether you're beginning a new project or repairing some clothing, identify what kind of fabric you're working with. Depending on the fabric, it will influence our choice of needles for the project. Check the wash tag to see what kind of material your garment is made out of. Next, thread. Depending on the repair or project, you will need thread to sew your material together. Today we're using a general purpose thread. This will suffice for most every repair or project we're doing. Next, we have needles. There are different kinds of needles for different material weights. The weight of the material is how thick a fabric is. We also have pins. When we're sewing fabric, pins will hold the material and pattern in place until you're ready to sew that part. This keeps the edges of your project neat and accurate. Try to use pins with colorful heads so that they'll be easy to find. You will not sew your project with pins. They are only for holding fabric in place. Next we have patterns. Depending on your project or repair piece, patterns are a helpful tool to guide your sewing. You can find patterns online and print them out, or you can check out a few of our books from the collection for patterns to copy. Patterns are also available at craft stores everywhere. When you're ready to attach patterns to your fabric, you'll want to make sure there are no wrinkles and bunches in the material. And that's when our iron comes in handy. With our iron, we will lay out the fabric and iron on a heat-safe surface, such as an ironing board or a wool mat. This will prevent your garment from having uneven links and borders or having loose material. Later, you will see how an iron can help us hem pants by holding a crease in place with the pins for an even stitch line. Next, we'll go over our cutting tools. Just like with cooking, a sharp-bladed pair of scissors is safest. Fabric scissors should only be used for fabric since paper and other materials dull the blade out over time. Your scissors should be able to cleanly and easily cut through material. There are many types of scissors to use, but here are a few you might be familiar with.
Scissors come with different handle grips depending on frequency of use and ergonomics. Find a pair that feel easy and natural for you to use. Shears are especially good for cutting patterns with lots of curves or detail. If sewing pillowcases or garments with long lines becomes a regular habit, consider getting a rotary cutter. Rotary cutters are a quilter's best friend. These are excellent at cutting neat, straight lines into cotton fabric. If you use a rotary cutter, be mindful of the blade and blade guard. You will also need a cutting mat so you do not ruin surfaces underneath the fabric you are cutting. We also have snips. Snips are small scissors specifically for cutting threads. You won't get very far cutting material with these, but they are very good for use in a travel sewing or mending kit. Now we're going to demonstrate a few basic stitches that we'll be using in today's activity. I'll demonstrate first using a yarn needle, yarn, and some plastic mesh so you can easily see how these stitches are made. Starting from the back of the mesh, I'm going to pull my threaded needle to begin my first stitch. Then I count 2 holes in the mesh and pull it through, starting from the front. Then I count 2 more holes and pull the needle through again from the back. Keep an even distance between the stitches and continue to the end of the mesh. A running stitch is useful in sewing basic seams into garments. It is made by running the needle through the material at an even distance. You can see that the stitches appear the same on both sides of the mesh, and they are evenly spaced out. Now we're going to make a basting stitch. A basting stitch is much like the running stitch we just did, but with much larger distances. So we start from the back of the mesh again and pull the needle through. And this time, I'm counting 4 holes before I pull the needle through from the front, and then count another 4 holes and pull the needle through from the back of the mesh. Count another 4 holes and continue in this pattern to the end of the mesh. This stitch is intended to temporarily hold the fabric of a garment together for either display purposes or to temporarily attach ruffles or pleats. It is meant to be removed. You can see how easily the thread is to pull out of the mesh. Now let's make a back stitch. Starting from the back of the mesh, pull the needle through the first hole, count 2 holes, then pull the needle through from the front. This is your initial stitch. Starting from the back of the mesh, count 2 holes and insert the needle through the second hole and pull through from the back of the mesh. Your beginning stitch should end up ahead of your first stitch. Now go back to where your first stitch ended and pull the needle through the same hole to the front of the mesh. Count 2 holes from the start point of the last stitch and pull the needle through from the back of the mesh. You'll end up ahead 2 spaces again. Then go back to the end point of the second stitch. Continue the pattern to the end of the mesh. A back stitch is one of the most common stitches that has many uses. This stitch is strong and is often used to attach 2 pieces of fabric together tightly and securely, especially in seams. In embroidery, it is used to outline designs or lettering. Now let's make a slip stitch or a blind stitch. This is a stitch that is actually harder to do on mesh than it is on fabric, but you can still observe the stitch more easily this way. First, we're going to fold up our mesh like you would prepare a hem. Later, when we demonstrate this on fabric, you'll see how an iron can help with this part. Now my mesh is folded as if I would fold a hem, and along the fold closest to the inside of the mesh, I'm going to start a stitch. Then I go back through the same spot on the outer mesh and bring it back, making a very small stitch. Tucking my needle under the hem, I space out the next stitch a good bit away from the end of the first stitch and pull the needle through both the inner seam and the outer mesh to make a small stitch. Repeat the stitch until your material is hemmed. Here we used a colored thread so the stitches can be more easily observed, but when repairing a garment, match the thread color with the fabric for a concealed stitch. Now let's repair a missing button. These shorts are missing a button, and since I only need one, I'm going to repurpose one of the pocket buttons that don't get used as much. Using my seam ripper, I dig underneath the button to cut the threads attaching the pocket button to the material. Now that I have my replacement button, I can thread my needle. Here I use a simple needle threader and thread that through my needle. Once through, I place the thread in the eye of my needle threader and then pull it through the eye of the needle like so. I like to line both sides of my thread up and make a double knot with the small loop so I can see where the end of my thread is. Observing the point in the fabric where the former button used to be, I make a small X stitch to anchor my button. This helps guide me to a small space to attach my button with my stitches. Starting from the back of the fabric, I pull the needle through the front and thread one of the buttonholes with my needle. Then, using a toothpick, I complete the stitch by sewing over the toothpick into a buttonhole on the opposite side. I do this twice through both buttonholes, trying to keep close to the initial anchor stitches. Once that's done, I can remove my toothpick, and now you can see my thread allowance, which will allow my button to close nicely with the buttonhole. I'm going to pull my needle through the back one last time and wrap the thread 5 times around the thread allowance. This is called a shank, and it neatly wraps up the extra thread so my button has some room to be closed. Going back through the anchor stitches one last time, I tie off my thread at the back of the material by tucking it underneath another stitch, and then knotting the thread close to the fabric. Snip off the excess thread. And here's our repaired button. Let's fix a rip in some jeans next. Here I have a pair of beloved ripped jeans. Rips happen and can really put a damper on your style. Using the running stitch and the back stitch we learned earlier, we're going to mend these jeans with an interior patch. First, we need to clean up the rip by snipping off excess thread and smoothing out the edges of the material. Then find a piece of fabric that closely matches your ripped material, or you could also experiment with some patterned or different colored fabric. Improve on your jeans by making the patch unique. Here I'm using some thin blue denim. Measure out your patch to be bigger than the rip. You're going to cover the rip with this material. Now turn your garment inside out and make sure your fabric is flat and relaxed, not stretched. Use pins or safety pins to attach the patch over the ripped material. The pins are going to hold the fabric in place while we sew. While you attach the pins, make sure you're only pinning the side of the garment that the rip is on, or you risk sewing your pant leg shut. To demonstrate the stitches easier, I've chosen embroidery floss for this repair. Embroidery floss is made up of 6 fibers, which are meant for you to separate out for your embroidery projects. I'm going to do the same here and separate 3 fibers for my patch. Since the 3 fibers are thicker than general purpose thread, I'm not going to double the thread up and knot it. Instead, I'll leave one side hanging freely to adjust as I use the thread. Knot the thread as usual and begin sewing along the edge of the patch, within the pinned area with a running stitch. Since we're sewing the garment from the inside out, let's remember to keep the knotted side of the thread on the side of the jean we see. That way, it will be hidden once the repair is done. Remember that the running stitch is made by evenly distancing the stitch and the space between the stitches. When you've sewn along the edges all the way back to the initial stitch and knot, tuck your thread under the last stitch you made and then knot the thread close to the fabric. Snip off the excess thread. Now that the inner patch is secured on the interior side, turn your pants right side out so you can see how the patch looks from the front. So far, so good. The frayed edges now need to be sewn onto the interior patch to stabilize the material. For this, we're going to use our back stitch. Flatten your material out again and pin the fabric surrounding the rip to the interior patch. This will help us sew the outer material to the patch without bunching the garment. You can improvise a design here by using different colors of thread and different stitches. Just be sure to sew the material surrounding the rip to the interior patch. This will prevent the rip from getting bigger. Remember that we start from the inside of our garment with our knotted thread and make one small initial stitch. Then we move forward from inside the garment with the same length of our first stitch and pull our thread from the back. The thread should begin a bit away from the last stitch you made. Then we put our needle back to the end of our initial stitch and pull the thread through from the front. Then we travel the needle the same length as our previous stitch from the inside of the garment and then pull the thread through to the front. Then go back to the end of the previous stitch and pull the needle through from the front of the garment. Repeat these steps until you've encircled the rip with your back stitch. Turn the garment inside out again and tuck your thread underneath the last stitch you made, then tie a knot close to the fabric. Now these jeans are rip-free and ready to wear again. Our last demonstration for today is a good bit more involved. You will need pins, your needle and thread, an iron and ironing board or a heat-safe surface, a seam ripper, and some scissors. First, measure how much you need to shorten your pant legs. Wearing your pants and some shoes you intend to wear with the pants, roll up the cuffs to the desired length. If you're feeling confident, carefully place 2 pins on the seams of the side of the pant leg to hold the material in place so you can take the pants off to adjust the cuffs for sewing. You can also try measuring the amount of fabric with a ruler or measuring tape. I have opted for this technique for the demo. I know I want these pants to be 2 inches shorter than they currently are. Using my ruler, I measure the sides and middle to make sure they are all evenly cuffed at 2 inches. After you remove the pants, measure how big the cuff is and adjust the material so that the width is the same alongside the cuff. Before we pin this, we are going to rip the existing hem so our sewing will be smoother. For this, we need our seam ripper. Seam rippers are shaped in such a way that you can insert the long edge of the fork underneath the hem and cut the thread holding the seam with the sharp inner corner. Handle these carefully. Notice that I'm avoiding using the seam ripper on the 2 hems that make up the side of the leg of the pant. Take your time and only rip the cuff seam. Once your seams are ripped, unfold the hem while maintaining the cuffed material and cut excess threads from the frayed fabric. This will make sewing easier. With your cuffed material still in place, get your iron and ironing board or heat-safe surface. Measure again to make sure that the fabric is still the same width across the cuffed material and then iron it. This will press a line where your pants will be hemmed and smooth out any lumps or bunched material in your fabric. After your garment is ironed flat, pin the cuffed material in place so that there is no lumps or bunched fabric when you begin sewing. This will keep your hem even and neat. For this demonstration, I've chosen to use red embroidery threads so that you can easily see where the stitches are and how to make them. We're going to use 3 threads again, knot and thread the needle, and I'm going to start on the inside fold of the cuffed material. Don't pull your needle through to the outer material or your stitches will show. Make sure your needle is where it should be before you pull your thread through the fabric. You'll notice that I poke the material a few times to make sure I'm a good distance away from the previous stitches and that I'm even with the other stitches I've made. Take your time. Once you're sure that your needle is only going through the inner cuffed material, pull your needle through. Then, just above the edge of the cuffed material, make a small stitch in the outer fabric of the jeans. Next, pull your thread through the inner cuffed material from the top of the fabric and travel your needle through to the back of the cuffed material and pull through the front again. Make a small stitch in the outer part of the material in line with the last stitch and pull the needle through. Return the needle through the front of the cuffed material and pull through the back. Travel a bit more to match the previous length you traveled and pull the thread through from the back of the cuff material. Repeat in this way until you go all the way around the pant opening. Now repeat for the other cuffed leg. Once you've made it back to the beginning, tuck your thread behind the last stitch you made and tie it off close to the fabric. Snip your excess thread and complete the process on the other pant leg. Turn your pants right side out and observe your slip stitches. They should be small and spaced out. The bottom of the pant leg should be even. If you matched your thread to your material, you will hardly see these stitches at all. After you are finished hemming your pants, be sure to put all your pins and needles away in safe, visible places. Accidentally finding a needle is a nasty surprise.
So that's all I have for you today. Join us at our follow-up mending clinic
November 18th.
from 6 to 7 p.m. on Zoom with any questions or problems you may encounter. Our next activity will be Embroidery 101, where we'll learn how to sew simple stitches and patterns and designs into our clothing like we talked about during our patching demo. See you then!